Genesis chapter 12. God's protection of the chosen. Viewing the Bible from the perspective of redemption history means focusing on God, the sovereign behind those figures, rather than the biblical characters themselves. This God-centered approach places God's sovereignty above human free will. Genesis chapter 12 describes God's sovereign choice of Abram, commanding him to go to the land I will show you, verse 1. This is God's sovereign call. So Abram went, as the Lord had commanded him, verse 4. This is man's response to God's command. This is faith. Faith is not blindly saying, I believe, but rather a correct response and decision to God's word. Remember, God's word precedes human faith. Therefore, in Genesis chapter 12, God's sovereign call and man's obedience through faith echo each other. By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed and went out to the land he would possess, but when he went out he did not know where he was going, Hebrews chapter 11 verse 8. When Abram arrived in the land of Canaan by faith, the Canaanites lived in that land, verse 6. That land was not deserted, but occupied. Abram could not find a place to pitch his tent. What were Abram's feelings at that time? Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your offspring, verse 7. This illustrates that the path of faith requires waiting and patience. Everything has its appointed time. Faith is when there seems to be no hope, for there is still hope in faith. What did Abram do? Thereupon Abram built an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent there. Bethel was to the west and Ai to the east. There he also built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Verses 7-8, the altar he built and the tent he pitched have profound significance. Building an altar to God and pitching a tent for himself were the two pillars of Abraham's faith, demonstrating that he was a sojourner on earth, a stranger. Then Genesis chapter 12 verse 10 says, a famine struck that land. The land that Abraham went to in faith, obeying God's word, encountered a famine, and a very severe one at that. This was a trial. Faith inevitably faces trials. This was arranged by God to test Abraham's faith. What did Abraham do when he encountered this trial? Because the famine was very great, Abram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while, verse 10. Was Abram's action correct? In other words, was it an act of faith in God? Why didn't God stop Abram from going down to Egypt, but allowed him to do so? This is a point worth pondering. Genesis chapter 26 says that in the days of Isaac, there was another famine in that land. Verse 1, so Isaac went to Gerar, to Abimelech king of the Philistines. Then the Lord appeared to Isaac and said, do not go down to Egypt, stay in the land I will show you. Verse 2, here, God is hindering him. God wanted to establish Abraham as the father of faith so that he would learn to rely on God alone, not on himself. This was God's plan to train Abraham's faith. Abraham's faith had not yet undergone any testing or edification. This is the same for everyone. Paul suffered greatly in Asia, even to the point of having no hope of survival. Brothers, we do not want you to be unaware of the troubles that came upon us in Asia. We were overwhelmed by an unbearable pressure, so that we had no hope of survival, and we ourselves determined in our hearts that we would die, so that we might not rely on ourselves but on God, who raises the dead, 2 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 8-9. Here, Paul testifies that this was God's plan of discipline. God permitted the great famine to teach Abraham that life should not be based on bread alone, but on faith. The central point in Abraham's life is chapter 15 verse 6, Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord credited it to him as righteousness. The pinnacle of his faith is in chapter 22, when God tests Abraham by asking him to offer his beloved only son, Isaac, as a burnt offering. Having put him through this ordeal, God wanted to test Abraham's faith. His faith was validated by God. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son, verse 12. From Abraham's entry into the school of faith in chapter 12 to his graduation exam in chapter 22, he underwent many trials and tribulations. What happened to Abram when he went down to Egypt? To save his life, he lied and claimed his wife was his sister. This act of unbelief led to unexpected and disastrous consequences. His wife was taken by Pharaoh, who gave her in return sheep, camels, donkeys, and male and female servants, verses 15 to 16. God's permission had to end there, he could no longer stand by and intervened. The Lord brought great plague on Pharaoh and all his household because of Sarai, Abram's wife, verse 17. God protected Sarai from harm. God did this not because Abraham had any qualifications or merits, nor because of Abraham's faith. The calamity should have fallen upon Abraham instead. This was entirely a sovereign act by God to send Jesus Christ through the descendants of Abraham and Sarah to accomplish the history of redemption. Why did you say she was your sister, that I took her to be my wife? Now that your wife is here, take her with you. Verse 19, Abram took his wife, Lot, and all that he had, and went up from Egypt to the Negev. Genesis chapter 13 verse 1, at this point, Abraham began his ascent. In the past, he had been on a downward path of faith, going down, Genesis chapter 12 verse 10. The lesson we learn from this is clear. God trains and shapes his chosen ones, and once chosen, he will protect them to the end. If we look at this from a purely personal perspective, what conclusion would we draw? To claim your wife is your sister and get rich? This is utterly absurd. This is why we should view the Bible from the perspective of redemption history. When we look at the Bible this way, today's words become relevant events to me, rather than simply lessons. If Sarai had been possessed by Pharaoh, God's plan of redemption would have suffered a major setback, and my redemption would not have been secure. Brothers, we must believe that God will protect, guide, and care for those saved through his election, just as he did for Abraham. Paul, understanding this, said, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" Romans chapter 8 verse 31. Let us all bow down before God's sovereignty, trust in the faithful God, and live by this faith. Questions of today. 1. What lessons were learned from the famine? 2. Please describe Abram's act of lying to his wife, claiming she was his sister, and going down to Egypt. 3. Why did God intervene in this matter?